Welcome to the Transatlantic, a podcast produced by the U.S. Helsinki Commission. Each episode, we will talk to people behind the debates and developments shaping the struggle for freedom and security here in the United States, Europe, Central Asia, and around the world. These conversations will cross oceans, intellectual divides, and political affiliations. We'll look forward to having you along for the ride. My name is Bakhti Nishanov, and I'm a senior policy advisor at the Commission, and I will be your host. Today, I'm joined by Georgiy Kent. Georgiy served as a Max Kampelman Policy Fellow at the Helsinki Commission, working on political and economic projects to hold Russia accountable for its ongoing war in Ukraine. He has worked at the Aspen Strategy Group, Harvard Kennedy School, Partnership for Public Service, and Atlantic Council. A graduate of Harvard College and Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, Georgiy specializes in security, economy, and state development in Europe, Asia, and post-communist societies. Today, he's an associate research and client strategy at Political Alpha, a political risk advisory firm in Washington, D.C. But this summer, he decided something different. He hopped on a bicycle and cycled across America to raise money for Ukraine. And we are here today to talk about that and everything else that Georgiy has been up to. Georgiy, welcome to our podcast. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. From the get-go, I do have to apologize. I had been fighting this nasty bout of the flu, so to our audience and to Georgiy, if my voice cracks or whatever, maybe I'm emotional or maybe it's just the consequences of the horrible flu that I had last week. So again, apologies for that. But let's just dive right in and let's talk about this amazing trip. You and I had talked about it, full disclosure. So I think some of these details, I think, I might have a little bit more information than our audience, but let's talk about it. So what made you get on a bicycle and who you did it with this summer? And give us a kind of 30,000-foot view of what you did this summer with your parents, right?
That's right. So this summer, my parents and I hopped on bicycles and cycled 4,400 miles across the United States. We started in Astoria, Oregon, and finished here in Washington, D.C. And our idea was to do something tangible to help Ukraine. I've lived, worked, and studied in Ukraine and studied Russian aggression. And having been in the country for 5 years, we understood what it means to help people on the ground and have those kind of interactions in person. And we also decided to combine the motivation of helping Ukraine with a personal interest in cycling. Mm-hmm. And it had been my dad's bucket list goal to cycle across America since he was my age. And so he retired in the spring. I graduated from my grad program in international security studies, and we decided that there's never been a more important time, almost 4 years into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, to raise funds online, but more importantly, in the American context, talk to people who often aren't exposed to international affairs in the American heartland, and see what they're thinking about the issue and how we might engage in dialogue about international affairs, about Ukraine, and hear what matters to them on the ground.
Amazing. So it sounds like it was an amazing family project, but also with a massive meaning behind it, that you were raising money for Ukraine. We'll talk about the logistics because that's a fascinating part of this. But tell me about, people do polls. We see all information. There's so much data about how Americans feel about Ukraine, what they think about Ukraine, but it's just some data point. But you actually have talked to everyday Americans, to people who didn't know you, but who wanted to engage with you on this topic. What was their reaction? I mean, I'm sure there were some outliers. Tell us about the outliers, but also just kind of overall sense of what you got from the Americans from our countrymen and women that you have run into during this amazing long bicycle ride.
I would say overwhelmingly our interactions with Americans was positive. We spoke to hundreds of people on the road. I mean, to give you context, it took us 80 days to get from the West Coast to the East Coast. And so we had a lot of opportunities to talk to people at rest stops, gas stations, motel breakfast areas. So we had a lot of chances to talk about the issue. And we also made an effort to wear clothing that might spark conversations, whether it was our Ukraine-themed cycling jerseys or activist T-shirts that said "Make Russia Small Again" or "Make Russia Pay," with a list of items that the Russians have destroyed in Ukraine. And this sparked conversations, and overwhelmingly positive. One example, we had an interaction in Oregon. We had passed a tourist shop with knickknacks on the Oregon coast, and we saw a Ukrainian flag outside of the storefront, and we thought, oh my goodness, we've just started this trip. We need to stop and talk to whether it's the owner or someone inside to see why they might hang a Ukrainian flag outside their establishment. We didn't get to speak to the owner, but we spoke to a woman inside who initially was reserved and didn't quite want to talk to us. We asked, we saw a Ukrainian flag outside. Could you tell us a little bit more about it? And you could tell she'd started looking at the issue of supporting Ukraine as a partisan one. She says, well, my boss is a Democrat. And that's all she gave us. And we responded with the polling data that we had seen. And we said, well, the majority of Republicans support Ukraine, and not only that, support sending arms to Ukraine. And she immediately responded, I told him that. So clearly she'd been following this issue and had this discussion with her boss, and that kind of opened her up. She was more willing to talk to us and explain the flag. And then when we mentioned that Russia had kidnapped over 20,000 Ukrainian children, she kind of reacted with shock and surprise and said, oh, I didn't realize that. And that really opened the floodgates to a really productive conversation. And by the end of it, she was telling us to come outside so we could take a photo in front of the flag. And so we saw kind of little bits of what we're seeing in the political space of instrumentalizing what is a bipartisan issue. But with in-person conversation, engaging in good faith, we were able to get past the surface level dynamics and get down to the more human elements of the issue that a lot of people, regardless of political affiliation, resonate with.
I think one of the reasons why we wanted to talk to you, Georgiy, is that, exactly that, the human element, that you have just talked to regular people. It's easy to sit in coastal elites, Northern Virginia, where I live, for example, and, say people feel this way or that way about Ukraine, but actually talk and convey your real concerns, and to talk to understand people and try to understand people how they feel about it and what they can do. I think that's key, and that you have done it with your dad, that you have done it in this way, very personal, that you are able to connect with people and get their feedback. Because ultimately what people want is to be heard. And I think that's what you provided. Not only you talked, but you also heard people. I think that's incredible. Just speaking of coastal elites, obviously, I tell people that in our neighborhood in Northern Virginia, probably the second most popular flag is Ukrainian, still is. Since the start of the war, you walk by people's houses and there are little flags, big flags, American flags, obviously, but also Ukrainian flags. But you went through America's heartland. You went through the very center of the American landmass. And what was some of the reactions there? What did you see there?
It was interesting that people often talk about the United States as, a collection of independent countries in some sense. And each state has its own culture and its own proud history. What we found is, based on our interactions, you could kind of group along our path our segment into three broader segments. Oregon coast and mountain areas, going all the way from Oregon up through the mountains and across the Rockies. The kind of row crop farm country of Kansas and Missouri. And then greater Appalachia, starting in southern Illinois, Kentucky, and ending, arguably here in the nation's capital. And we noticed that initially there was a lot of on-the-ground support for Ukraine that we hadn't anticipated in very remote areas of Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. And we had these interactions where we'd be in a town of 200, 300 people, and we'd be in the parking lot of a grocery store, and someone would see our cycling jersey and say, oh my goodness, Ukraine, why are you wearing that? We would explain we're fundraising and whatnot. And they would just pull cash right out of their pocket and hand it to us and trust that what we had said that we were doing, they'd trust us and say, we support the people in Ukraine. It's really awful what's happening there. And that wasn't our goal initially. Our goal was to fundraise online from an audience that we knew were more likely to donate to our cause, and just talk to people on the ground. But we didn't expect this outpouring of support. We got a little colder reception, not negative per se, but let's just say more neutral as soon as we crossed into Kansas and Missouri. In talking to them, you could tell that they were comfortable speaking to us, clearly outsiders in full Lycra, spandex kind of gear, about the weather, about the road conditions, about the crop yields, and if we were to push them, about how the Trump administration's tariff policy was affecting them. But as soon as we talked about Ukraine, it was like a wall would go up. They would say, have a nice day, stay safe on the roads. And one clear example of this is we got far enough into a conversation with a person specifically focusing on the cycling element of the trip. And he's, I follow a couple of cycling Instagram accounts. Do you guys have an Instagram account? And we did, because that was how we were updating our followers and keeping track of our progress. And he was this close to pressing the follow button when my dad mentioned, when we're fundraising for Ukraine. He lifted up his finger, locked his phone, and wished us a nice day. So that was an interesting dynamic that we saw, that people were less willing to engage in Kansas and Missouri. That said, we had two kind of really wonderful interactions, one with an older farmer named George, who had made the connection between Ukraine's farming culture and economy and his own lifestyle. And he told us over breakfast that when he first saw the Russians dismantling and stealing Ukrainian farmers' combines and taking them back to Russia, it angered him to his core. And when we added, they're also stealing grain and selling it on the open market. And he says, and that's all he needed to see as a farmer. Those combine harvesters are so important and for their livelihoods, and they're so expensive. We heard many farmers talking about how expensive this farming equipment is, and how kind of the cost of inputs going up have really hurt them in the last 3 years. And so he really resonated with that. And we had another woman from Kansas, but a tourist here in D.C. at the end of our trip, here that we had passed through her town.
Oh, wow.
Because I was just talking to my friends, and she whipped her head around and said, Kansas? It's like, that's right, we cycled straight through it. A beautiful country. It wasn't actually as flat as people were telling us it was going to be. There are beautiful hills in the eastern part. And she pulled out $20 and donated it to our campaign. So we can't say, all of kind of Kansas and Missouri were kind of colder on the idea, but just in our person-to-person interactions, they were a little more reserved. But as soon as we got into Greater Appalachia, Southern Illinois, Kentucky, people started talking again and engaging more. They were more interested in our cycle and the topic itself.
Incredible. I think what you're saying speaks to the power of human-to-human connection. That farmer being able to understand what Ukrainian farmers are going through. It's easy to dismiss, when people talk about casualties, when we talk about those things, which are horrendous and tragic, but it's sometimes, I think you get numb, right? It's just big numbers that is very difficult to comprehend. But I think the story of this farmer, where he could relate immediately, right, to Ukrainians, and this is happening on national scale in Ukraine. I mean, this is happening to farmers, but it's happening to museums. This literally, videos of Russian soldiers taking animals from the zoo, right? The ugliness of it is just horrendous. Let me ask you this. The folks that, might have been less supportive, more critical of, what you're trying to do, maybe not critical, but again, less supportive of what you were trying to do, did you kind of pick up on their sense of what their concerns might be? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, I do believe Americans are fair and honest people. And sometimes they're just presented with wrong information. Sometimes they want to see things the way they've been told to see. And what are their concerns? And I think, hopefully that means that with a little bit of additional information, we're not going to be able to change everybody's minds, but maybe something could change and sway them, right, to support Ukraine.
One example comes to mind, and it was a conversation that we had in Prineville, Oregon. So people think of Oregon as Portland and the greater Portland area and maybe the coast. But it's the political and cultural makeup of Oregon is more diverse than we could have ever imagined. So we were in the eastern part, up in the high desert, Prineville, Oregon, a large evangelical population. Faith and Christianity are a big part of the local culture. And we were at a kind of a beer garden, which was bustling and it was full. So there were no tables for us to sit down, but we were invited by a lovely couple to sit and have dinner with them at their table. And we got to talking, and we were explaining our trip, and they were mostly receptive, but the husband had some questions specifically about, how much are we spending on Ukraine? Like, where is the money going? Where, you see all these top line figures, large sums of money, where is it all going and whatnot? And having someone with experience, like my dad, someone with lived experience, like my mom and myself, explaining exactly how the aid structures functioned, how Ukrainians were using. It's not just cash. It's painting a picture and telling a story of saying, well, the surplus material that the U.S. would send over within a short period of time is on the front line and being used, and that's shown in imagery and blowing up tanks and various elements, and having someone that isn't necessarily not a talking head, not on Fox News, not on CNN, someone in person with real life experience, being there in Prineville, Oregon, which frankly, I wouldn't imagine many Washington establishment types get out to very often. Talking about their experience, being a credible voice was extremely valuable to these people, because they said, we don't know what the truth is anymore. And they said this generally, not just about any kind of political siloed media, but information in general, across the board. And having someone in person speaking to them was extremely valuable, to the point for after the conversation, they remarked, we lead the prayer group at our church. And, if we think about it, I would say most of our church are pro-Ukrainian. And we would love, how long are you here? We were only there for a day, unfortunately, but how long are you here? We would love for you to talk to our congregation. They would really appreciate hearing from you. And one of the elements that struck with them was highlighting Russia's repression of Protestant and specifically evangelical Christians in occupied territories, explaining how not only the Russian government has instrumentalized the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, but specifically when occupying Ukrainian territory, some of the first groups of people that they would go after, imprison, torture, execute in some examples, were evangelical Protestants. And again, that resonated deeply with this community, and they hadn't heard this information before. So it was important to one, understand who our audience was, who we were talking to, what mattered to them, and bring up facts, speaking completely from a fact-based perspective, but things that would resonate with people, whether it's kind of episodes of farming in kind of middle in Kansas and Missouri, or the religious persecution element in more evangelical country up in Oregon.
Amazing. Georgiy, I have to compliment you on your shirt. The beautiful vyshyvanka that you have, you clearly have a Ukraine connection, right? Beyond just your interest, professional interest. Tell us a little bit more about your personal connection to Ukraine, and how did it come to be that you are such a relentless advocate for Ukraine?
Of course. So I guess the first connection would be through my mother's side. So my mom, Georgiy Kent, is Crimean Tatar, which is a minority indigenous to the Crimean Peninsula. And in 1944, Stalin deported the entire population to Central Asia. And that's actually where my parents met on my father's first diplomatic tour, was in Tashkent. And so that was the first kind of connection to Ukraine and the region, but really living in Kyiv, interacting with Crimean Tatars who had been forced out of Crimea after 2014, and seeing Ukrainian activists fighting to improve their country after the Revolution of Dignity really inspired a lot of action that my family has taken to support the country, because it's made so many strides since its independence to better itself. And a lot of that is driven from civil society. And this, in part, this civil society-driven activism and pushing for reforms and principled governance, in part informed our trip this summer, because we were working with some Estonian civil society activists with the NAFO 69th Sniffing Brigade to offer basically a deliverable for our fundraising. We weren't fundraising for fundraising's sake.
Right.
We could present our audience and tell people on the ground that we were working with a credible organization based in Estonia who would outfit pickup trucks with anti-drone countermeasures, anti-mud, kind of special tires, painting and outfitting these used trucks and sending them directly to the front line. And being able to say that your money is going specifically directly into a product that's going and helping save lives on the front line meant a lot. And it allowed us to tell a compelling story and come from a place of credibility from a fundraising standpoint, because we were working with a reputable organization. But going back to the Ukraine connection and this Vyshyvanka, which is in Ukraine, Vyshyvankas and embroidery is regional. So this is from the Ivano-Frankivsk region. I kind of learned Ukrainian and spent some time out in Ukraine, and so that's where I picked this up. But so it's a combination of my family heritage, lived experience, seeing Russian aggression firsthand, and then following that up with academic research, professional work, and continued interest in helping the people of Ukraine.
Thank you, Georgiy. Let me ask you this. This is slightly off topic, but it's still about Ukraine, just simply because there are these narratives floating around, including, unfortunately, here on the Hill, about the persecution of Christians in Ukraine, alleged.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do quote unquote here, but because I want to hear from you, it's probably very obvious what I think about it. But this idea that is, frankly, I strongly believe in. There is strong evidence to suggest this is being pushed by Russia and its agents, that somehow Ukraine is, which is a Christian majority country, to be absolutely clear, is somehow discriminating, arresting, or harassing Orthodox Christians. Yeah. Can you speak to that? Is there any truth to that?
I guess I would say to answer this question, you have to go back to thinking about the topic. Why did the Soviet Union, founded on atheism and secularism, reincorporate the Russian Orthodox Church and religion in general into their state practice? My great-grandfather on my or great-great-grandfather on my mother's side was a Russian Orthodox priest who was kind of taken by the Soviets and killed for practicing that religion. And you have to wonder, why in the 80s did they reincorporate the church? In part is because they realized that religion, and specifically religious institutions, were very effective ways of monitoring and controlling the population. And so when they brought back the Russian Orthodox Church in the Soviet times, many of the priests and leadership were just simply not even tangentially affiliated with the KGB, but KGB agents. And the Russian Federation continued this practice of using the church and the institutions of the church to influence, monitor, and control populations at this point in independent Ukraine. And so there are cases and kind of proven cases of Russian Orthodox Church leaders in 2014, specifically compelling, acting on behalf of the Russian government, whether it was in Crimea, approaching Ukrainian soldiers on Ukrainian bases, or in kind of eastern Ukraine, to compel their population, which at that point considered themselves to be Ukrainian. Yes, they might not have agreed with the government or had different political views, but were considered themselves citizens of the country of Ukraine, and were influencing them to act a certain way. And so in that sense, you have to take that whole history into account when looking at actions against not the Orthodox Church in general, but specifically the institution following the Moscow Patriarch. And you also have to bring up these examples of prosecution and persecution of Christians in Ukraine, whether they're evangelical Christians, Protestants, Ukrainian Orthodox.
In Russia.
In Russia, as well as in occupied territories.
In occupied territories.
That's right. And in Ukraine. So that would be sort of how I approach the issue and think about the history and how the Kremlin has instrumentalized the Russian Orthodox
So
Church.
in essence, what you're saying, that Russian Orthodox Church is an institution of the Russian government. It's a part of the Russian government, no matter how you look at it. And Ukraine is just simply trying to survive. It's not arresting. There are tens of thousands of religious organizations in Ukraine of different denominations, different faiths, different religions, and everybody coexists peacefully.
Yeah.
Again, I say, Ukraine is a Christian majority country that has a Jewish president and had a Muslim defense minister until recently, and it's a beautiful story of coexistence. So these narratives out there that somehow Ukraine is harassing, arresting Christians is simply not true. So thank you so much for talking about in detail about why this is not true at all. Let me ask you this, just because I have huge interest in nutrition. So tell me about what you ate. How many miles a day did you cover?
Yeah.
Talk about the logistics of it, because that part is insane. I mean, being on a bike for how many hours a day on average, and how long did it take you?
So I would say I'll start with the miles, and then I'll get to the food, which may be the most important part of the entire
100%,
trip.
yes.
So we were averaging about 57 miles a day.
Goodness,
and it would depend on the terrain, whether or not we had a lot of hills to climb, mountains to summit, you could say, or if the path was relatively flat. I would say our longest single day in terms of mileage and also time in the saddle was in Kansas. You might not be surprised. It was in Kansas, but we cycled 106 miles in a single day, and that took us about 9.5 hours overall, and specifically 7.5 hours on the bike itself. We had about 2 hours of breaks, water, food. It was difficult, I won't lie. I mean, you can even train up and be a fairly fit cyclist, but doing that much every day, it took about, at least for me, about 3 weeks to a month to get my legs up into shape, even having trained the previous 2 or 3 months before the trip. And after that, you kind of built in the mental capacity. Okay, you gave yourself little signposts. I've done 25 miles. I have 25 more today. And you kind of built up the fitness. That was no longer the issue. The issue then became managing hydration,
of course,
and food. And people think when you exercise, water's important, which it is. It's very important. But when you're doing endurance events like cycling, running, these kind of things, food, and specifically simple carbs, sugar is very important. You'll have these fitness...
Those glycogen reserves just drop.
Yeah, you'll have these fitness influencers telling you to cut sugar, don't eat your carbs, don't eat your rice. But when you're cycling 60 miles a day, you're basically drinking 6 liters of water and eating, over probably 3,500 calories a day. So I was basically eating 3 meals per meal. And that was the only way to kind of sustain this event. And even then, sometimes you'd get it wrong. You'd eat something at the wrong time. You wouldn't time it right. Once you got off the coast, your options in terms of food on the road were fairly limited. You had beef, you had hamburgers. You'd be lucky maybe if you get chicken. And so it was kind of, we're eating a lot, but cycling a lot. And in the end, I think we ended up dropping weight, even eating as much as we did, because you're burning so many calories on the road. But stopping for food and rest and water gave us opportunities to talk to people, especially in Kansas and Missouri, where we found that we would often come in to local farmers having discussions, and we could tell, or we noticed that gas stations and convenience stores became, or have become, kind of the town square, so to speak, where people would gather, eat, talk, commiserate often about the weather, about roads, about the crop yields. And so that gave us an opportunity to fuel up, talk to people, and help them.
Incredible. Tell me about how much money you have raised, and you'd mentioned what would happen to it. The money, I assume, has long been delivered, and I'm sure it's gone to good uses. But tell me how much you've raised, and what exactly was bought with the money raised.
So over the course of the 3 months, we raised $103,000.
Incredible! Wow.
And this blew away our expectations. We were planning to raise enough for maybe 2 or 3 vehicles. And for context, one vehicle cost about $23,000 to outfit, refurbish, and then transport to Ukraine. And so with the amount that we'd raised, we were able to raise enough for 4 vehicles, 3 trucks, and a van, kind of like a mini bus. And 2 of the vehicles were delivered while we were on the trip, so kind of midway point, the organization in Estonia told us, all right, we're ready, we're sending it in the next convoy. And then the last 2 vehicles were delivered last November, and my parents were actually able to join the convoy and drive the truck from Tallinn, Estonia, all the way to Kyiv and meet the unit that was going to be using the vehicle. And we were able to, and this was wonderful for us because we were able to show our audience that, look, your money went, here's where it went. We were working with a very transparent organization. We were showing the deliverables, and we could prove that these are the people that are going to be using the truck. Because not only was the person-to-person human connection important when interacting with Americans, but the fact that we could say that these are the people, these are the individuals, here's their name, here's his call sign, this is their unit, and put a face to a truck, to the campaign, really added to making the story and the project compelling and showing and delivering on our promise at the start of the trip for the fundraising and for delivering the aid to Ukrainian units.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This is incredible. One last question, and so I think it's a broader, bigger picture question. Having done this, are you optimistic, more optimistic, less optimistic about America specifically, and about Americans' perceptions of Ukraine, and about the future of Ukraine?
I would say it's sort of mixed. Mostly optimistic. I'm generally an optimistic person, but going into this trip, especially living in D.C. and consuming the information coming out of politics here on Russia's war on Ukraine, especially in the last year or so, there's a sentiment or a perception that America doesn't care about Ukraine. What we learned is that Americans, on an individual basis across the country, are still plugged in on the issue. They're paying attention, and they care. And that came out in our conversations, in people's willingness to donate, and throughout the country, not just on the coasts, but in the mountains, in both mountains, in the Appalachian Mountains and in the Rocky Mountains, and even in flashes in farm country. And so that gave me some optimism that people were still willing to donate. It's just what it takes is having someone in front of them to talk about the issue, because there's a lot of mistrust in our politics, in our media, and so that's that was discouraging to see how disillusioned people were about the information that they might be consuming or where they can get accurate information. But it was encouraging that being in front of somebody and talking to them, you can have productive conversations with people that might have wildly different political affiliations. But that sort of just demonstrated to us Americans care about Ukraine, they care about supporting Ukrainians, and it's still an issue. And this is backed up in the polling, but in our conversations, it showed that people approach this issue from with common sense, with empathy, and that's something often missing in our debates here in Washington about the issue, where we're stuck in policy land and often don't listen to Americans who are approaching these issues from a very reasonable and relate, like from a point of relating and having empathy. And so that was encouraging.
What you said is absolutely key. Americans care about this issue. So supporting Ukraine is a good thing to do, but it's also a smart thing to do. Our policymakers hopefully will continue to support Ukraine until the day when Ukraine says that they're done and they have won this on their own terms. Georgiy, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah.